You know, it's funny how silence can be louder than words, especially when it comes from people you once thought would never forget you. I remember the first time they forgot my birthday. It stung a little bit, but I told myself, they're busy. Life gets in the way. I was 65 back then, still full of energy, still believing that families always find their way back to each other. But year after year, the silence grew heavier. 10 birthdays passed, 10 years, not one call, not one card, not even a message. And that's when something inside me started to shift. See, when you reach a certain age, you stop expecting grand things from people. You start appreciating small gestures, a visit, a shared meal, a phone call, just to ask if you're doing all right. But when even those vanish, you start to wonder if your presence was ever valued, or if you were just convenient when they needed something. I wasn't a bitter man. At least I didn't want to be. I'd spent my entire life working hard, raising my kids, and providing for everyone. Every bill, every loan, every sacrifice. I carried it with pride. Because family was everything to me. My wife had passed away 15 years ago, and after she was gone, I made a promise to keep the family close. But grief does strange things to people. My kids drifted apart, chasing their own worlds, bigger houses, fancier cars, louder lives. And somewhere in all that noise, they forgot the man who taught them how to ride a bike. You might think I'm exaggerating, but it's the truth. On my 75th birthday, I sat alone at the kitchen table, a small slice of cake in front of me. The same kitchen that once echoed with laughter, now quiet enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't light candles that year. What's the point when there's no one to blow them out with you? But here's where the story starts to twist a little. Because while they were busy forgetting, I was busy planning. I had a secret, one that I carried quietly for years. See, I wasn't poor like they assumed. Sure, I lived simply. Old car, small house, modest clothes. But I'd been careful all my life. I'd invested smart, bought property when prices were low, and by some miracle, or maybe discipline, my net worth had quietly crossed a few million. They didn't know. I didn't tell them. They never asked. And maybe that's where it began, this quiet experiment I built in my heart. I wanted to see if love could exist without money attached, if my children would still show up for me without expecting anything in return. Spoiler alert, they didn't, not once. Every year, I waited. And every year, I learned a little more about how silence shapes you. It doesn't just hurt, it sculpts you. It makes you think differently. So I started keeping a diary, not out of sadness, but out of clarity. Every forgotten birthday, every missed visit, every ignored message, I wrote it all down. Not to guilt them, just to remember what forgetting feels like. You know what's ironic? On the 10th year, my 85th birthday, my oldest son, David, finally called. His voice sounded like it used to when he needed money. "Hey, Dad," he said casually, "we were thinking of visiting sometime soon." Sometime soon. Not happy birthday, not we miss you, just a vague, guilt-free sentence floating on the phone line. I smiled and said, "I'd like that." But that night, after hanging up, I opened my diary one last time. I read through all those quiet years, all those small heartbreaks stacked together like brittle pages, and I realized something. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't supposed to wait for them anymore. Maybe it was my turn to write the ending, and that's when I began crafting my will, not as revenge, but as a message. A lesson written in ink, not anger, because if they couldn't remember me while I was alive, I'd make sure they never forgot me after I was gone. I remember the smell of the lawyer's office. Old paper, lemon polish, the kind of quiet that makes you look at your hands and wonder what they spent a lifetime doing. He was a good man, polite and precise, and he'd known our family for years. When I told him I wanted to change my will, he didn't flinch. He'd seen grief do stranger things. He sat back, steepled his fingers, and said, "Tell me what you want to do." I told him plain as day. I wanted the will to be a lesson. I wanted it to be something my children would talk about at the reading, something they'd never forget. Not to shame them, not to burn bridges, but to make sure the truth of those 10 forgotten birthdays sat in the center of the room like a single bright lamp. He cleared his throat and asked, "Are you sure you want it to be public?" I looked at him and said, "Yes. Let the truth be loud enough that it cannot be ignored. so we plotted in the small legal language he favored. A trust here, a conditional clause there. I left money to charities I cared about, and parcels of land to people who had given me kindness without asking for anything in return. For my children, I left things that mattered, but with conditions that would force them to face what they'd done. I did not want to take away. I wanted to make them pause. For Emily, I left the house, but not in the way you expect. She could only inherit it if she could prove she'd volunteered 100 hours at the local senior center in the 2 years before the reading. For David, a chunk of savings would only be released if he could show sustained involvement, not a single phone call, but a pattern, monthly visits recorded and verified by the caregiver they'd hired. For my granddaughter, I set up a scholarship, but the guardian funds would be distributed only if the family could demonstrate they had spent a year supporting a community project together. Little things, practical things, nudges toward presence, and then there was a small twist. I arranged for the will reading to include a video. Not a long speech, nothing dramatic. Just me sitting at my kitchen table in the late afternoon light, talking as if I were telling a friend a story. I wanted my voice in the room. I wanted them to hear me say the things I'd never had the courage to say out loud when anger might have ruined the moment. I told the lawyer that the video should play before the lawyers handed over the documents. Let my face be the first thing they saw. If you're imagining bitterness, picture this. I spoke with a steady voice, a little humor, remembering the silly things we'd shared, and then I folded in truth. I told them how it felt to be forgotten in small, honest phrases. Not to punish, not to shame, but to teach. Once the will was signed and filed, I slept differently. There was a lightness to it, like the moment you finally tell someone a secret and it's no longer choking you. I started going for walks again, returning to the little joys I'd let slip while waiting for people who were too busy to notice. I took up wood carving, learned to make small wooden toys, and left them on doorsteps for neighbors. Sometimes I'd deliver them myself, watch the children's faces, and laugh in a way I hadn't in years. There was a cruel pleasure in that, I'll admit, but sweeter were the quiet smiles that met me back. Of course, you understand, life doesn't wait for your plans to unfold. Schedules collide with accidents and small surprises. One autumn, my knees gave me trouble and a neighbor recommended a new doctor. That doctor, a lively woman who'd recently moved back to town, took a particular interest in the old men who sat alone in the clinic waiting room. She would bring tea, listen to stories, and make sure the prescriptions were filled. We became friends in that easy way old people do, at the intersection of shared afternoons and checked calendars. She reminded me I wasn't invisible to everyone. Not everything I wanted had to be dramatic to be meaningful. Months passed, and then the first ripple came. My daughter showed up at the clinic one afternoon, flustered, saying she'd been in the neighborhood for work and thought she'd stop by. She hugged me like someone who'd misplaced a fragile thing and found it again. Her eyes darted to the bandage on my hand, to the cane leaning against my chair. I felt a twinge of the old businesses of life, the rush to fix what's easily broken. We spoke of weather, of my knee, of grandchildren's school plays, easy topics that served as a bridge back into conversation. She didn't mention the will. She didn't have to. Then came the day when the letter arrived. The lawyer sent a polite note, borrowing his phrasing about final arrangements, and reading of the will. The date was set for midwinter, when families gather because it's hard to be alone in cold weather. I invited a few neighbors to tea to keep my calendar gentle. The day of the reading, I woke early, made coffee, and listened to the house breathe around me. I could hear the first flurries hitting the windows. There's something about snow that sharpens listening. People arrived in the small, staggered way family does. Apologies stitched into every embrace. My son claimed traffic. My daughter said she'd been held up at work. My sister arrived with a casserole and a face that tried to hold steadiness. The room felt full as they took their seats, muffled conversations humming. When the lawyer stood, the room quieted in that way rooms do, as if hearing a bell. He pulled out the usual papers, read out the formalities, and then, as planned, he hit play on the little DVD case I'd handed him. My voice filled the room, softer than I'd imagined in that echoing space, a voice that had been my companion for a lifetime. I spoke of birthdays and of a child who forgot to take the sugar out of a cake, of how I'd been the one making sure everyone else had candles. I told small stories, and with each memory unearthed, the room grew quieter. I spoke about how silence builds itself like a wall around you, and how being forgotten is less about a single absent call and more about a slow erosion of meaning. I watched them watch me. My daughter's hand creased around a napkin. My son's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on a point on the floor that wasn't there. When the video ended, there was a pause, a certain kind of silence that felt like the world holding its breath. Then the lawyer, with a careful tone, started to read the will. He read each clause, each conditional gift. He explained what involvement meant for Emily, what consistent contact meant for David. He explained the scholarship and the small trust set aside for neighbors who had quietly loved his children when they were young. I noticed faces as the words sank in, surprise, confusion, shame, a flicker of shame that looked almost like regret. My granddaughter opened her mouth and then closed it. She was young for this kind of grief and didn't quite know how to translate it into words. After the reading, people murmured. My son stalked out first, the old pride closing like a trunk lid. He left his coat behind, and the door slammed like a final chapter, perhaps too loud. My daughter lingered, knelt by my side, and took my hand. "Dad," she said, voice shaking, "I didn't know." I'm so sorry. I didn't punish her sorrow. I simply nodded and let the tea I had made cool between us. She asked if the will could be amended, if insurance could be cashed out quicker, if payments could be accelerated. I shook my head. I had done this carefully. The lesson was in the waiting. That night after they left, I walked the rooms and listened to the old house settle. I found the casserole dish in the sink, dried my hands, and sat at the kitchen table. I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Relief because the truth had been told. Exhaustion because truth can be an interaction brute enough to leave you tired. But above all, I felt a curious hush. The kind of hush that comes after a storm, when the air is thick with the possibility of change, and change did come slowly, like the thawing of ice. Emily visited more often, not out of duty, but because she'd seen the video and the will and had realized how much she'd been drifting. She started spending hours volunteering, sitting with other seniors at the center, listening, holding hands when people trembled during medication times. Her hours mounted, and I would check them off in secret in a little notebook where I had written the dates of forgotten birthdays. I didn't gloat when she earned her first 100 hours. I simply felt the steady warming of something sacred returning. David was harder. He would come to the house, sit at the head of the table like a man sizing a problem, and then leave with words about timing and business, and this can't be financed right now. But the law moved in time, and his pockets had noise in them that softened when he considered the quiet of his children needing a grandfather present. It would take him longer, but one evening he knocked on the door with a small cake, a real one, the kind with too many candles. He stayed for dinner, and for the first time in years, the house hummed with voices of more than one generation. I won't tell you it was all sweetness after that. Relationships are not fairy tales sewn up neat at the end. There were hard words, tears, and a slow rebuilding that required patience I hadn't expected to need at my age. There were mornings when I would wake with an ache at my ribs because the old habit of guarding myself was stubborn and quick. But there were also afternoons with my granddaughter learning to carve wood beside me, her hands clumsy and earnest. And those afternoons were like clean water, restorative. A year after the reading, when the conditions I'd set were met in awkward, fumbling ways that made my heart swell, the trust disbursement happened. I watched as my children navigated the terms I'd left them, not as punishments, but as invitations. Emily came to the house on the morning the deed transferred, and she stood at the threshold, eyes wet, and said, "I understand. Thank you." David later brought his children over and introduced them to the man who'd once built them a backyard fort with nothing but a hammer and hope. The surprise I left in my will wasn't a single dramatic moment of vengeance. It was a long, quiet lesson that unfolded in their lives like slow light through curtains. It made room for repair and In its own way, it was kinder than the anger that had wanted to lash out. I had considered humiliating them in the harshest terms, leaving extravagant sums to strangers, or burying a note that would shame them. But I chose something else. I chose to make memory unavoidable, to give them the work of becoming present again. When I look back, what I am proudest of isn't that they finally remembered my birthdays. It's that they returned with different hands, hands that could hold, not just take. That, after years of forgetting, they learned to mark time with presence rather than convenience. Maybe that's a softer victory than some would prefer, but it is enough for me. Enough to sit on the porch in late afternoon sun and feel the warmth on my face and not feel irrelevant. People sometimes ask me if I regret playing that trick with the will. I tell them no. I regret the years I waited in silence before deciding to do something about it, but not the choice itself. I learned that sometimes love needs a little architecture, a structure that forces priorities into the open. If a legal document nudged them back into life, then so be it. I wanted them to remember, and they did. Not because they feared loss, but because they chose to be different, and that, in the end, feels like the most honest kind of inheritance. Not the money, not the house, but a new pattern of being, a habit of showing up. If that was my final gift, then I was content. If that makes me cold, then I'll accept that label. But if it makes them better, then I have no regrets. Years later, when I sit in my favorite chair and watch the light move across the walls, I sometimes pull out that diary I kept during the years of forgetting. The pages are worn at the corners. Some entries are bitter, some tender, but they all remind me of one thing: we all forget. The trick is in how we remember to come back. And sometimes it's not about the people who come back, it's about the person you become while waiting. I used to think forgiveness was a gift you gave someone else, but now I know it's a quiet mercy you give yourself. Because if you keep carrying anger, it turns into a house you can never leave. And I'd lived in that house long enough, so one spring morning, I closed that old diary for good. The air smelled like rain and jasmine, and the neighborhood kids were laughing in the distance. I remember thinking, this is how peace sounds. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just small and real. I brewed my tea, added the perfect amount of sugar, and sat outside watching the sunrise melt the chill off the garden. For the first time in a long while, I didn't think about who wasn't there. I thought about who I was still becoming. It's funny, you spend most of your youth chasing things, money, approval, love, and then, in old age, you realize the chase was never the prize. The real treasure is time. The quiet moments where no one needs you to perform, to explain, to prove. Just you and the hum of your heartbeat reminding you you're still here. One afternoon, I got a letter. It wasn't formal like the ones from the lawyer, and it wasn't one of those hollow birthday cards with pre-printed words. It was from my granddaughter. She wrote in careful cursive, "Grandpa, I still have the wooden bird you carved for me. Mom says you used to make one every year, but she lost hers. Can you teach me how?" I smiled so wide my cheeks ached. That letter sat on my lap for a long time before I picked up the phone and called her. She sounded shy at first, then brighter when I told her I'd been keeping a few carving tools ready just in case. We started meeting every Sunday. She'd sit beside me on the porch, wood shavings collecting like golden snow around our feet, and we'd carve birds that didn't always look like birds, but they were ours. Through those sessions, something magical happened. My daughter started dropping her off early and staying. At first, she'd hover in the doorway, pretending to scroll on her phone. Then she'd sit with us sipping tea. One day she laughed, really laughed, and said, "Dad, I forgot how loud you chew." And that's when I knew the world had turned again. Those Sundays became sacred. Sometimes my son would join, bringing groceries, awkward at first, like he was learning a new language. But the small talk grew into real talk. We spoke of their mother, of the years between us, and of the quiet ways life tries to apologize. I didn't need them to say sorry anymore. Their presence said enough. On my 76th birthday, they surprised me. Nothing extravagant, just a small gathering in the backyard, the same one where I used to grill hot dogs when they were little. There was a cake, Vanilla with too much frosting, just the way I liked it. My granddaughter lit the candles and said, "Make a wish." I looked at their faces glowing in the candlelight, my family imperfect but here, and I didn't need to wish for anything. My wish had already come true. Later that night, after everyone left and the stars came out, I sat with the last slice of cake and thought about the years I'd spent being angry. The wasted energy, the loneliness that felt righteous at the time. I realized the will, that so-called surprise, wasn't just for them. It was for me too. It forced me to confront how much I'd allowed bitterness to become my companion. If you're listening to this and you've been carrying hurt for years, maybe from family, maybe from friends, I want to tell you something I learned too late. They may never understand what they did. They may never say the words you think will heal you, but you can still let go. You can still build peace without their permission. I left them something in my will to remember me by. But what they gave me in the end was something deeper. The proof that love can be rebuilt, even after forgetting. It doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in the small things. In the tea that never goes cold, in the phone call that doesn't have to last long, in the word "Dad," spoken without tension. Now, when I sit in that same chair and the sunlight crawls across the wall, I don't think about the birthdays they missed. I think about the ones we found again. I think about how forgiveness didn't erase the past. It just gave the future a place to stand. And if I've learned anything after 70-plus years, it's this. Families are fragile things, but so are second chances. Hold both with care, because one day you'll want to look back just like I do and smile, not because they remembered, but because you did. That's my story. And if it reminds you of someone you've lost touch with, maybe it's time to pick up the phone. You never know what peace might sound like on the other end.